Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Heat is Rising, Harmful Environmental Agendas and Tactics in France, Germany, and the Netherlands. I'm gonna give just a moment of more participants join the room. Number is increasing. It's great to see already so many of you here. So I guess I can already start introducing myself. My name is Ana Romero. I am a content disinformation expert at EU DisinfoLab, and I'll be moderating today's session. So today's webinar marks the official launch of the HEAT investigation, a cross-border research project delivered by Logically and EU DisinfoLab with the support of the European Media and Information Fund. We are very pleased to be joined today by the lead investigators from Logically, as well as our policy expert at EU DisinfoLab, who will walk us through HEAT's scope and methodology, what we uncovered, and why it calls for urgent attention from both platforms and policymakers. So a big thank you to all our speakers for joining us today, and of course, a warm thank you to all of you for turning in. Your presence and engagement on this issue really truly matters, and we hope this session offers good insights and practical takeaways. Before we get going, just a quick update that we are very especially excited about. Registrations for our annual conference is open. It's happening in October 15th, 16th in Ljubljana, Slovenia. Spots are limited, so don't wait. And we'll be announcing very soon some of the sessions and speakers. I can tell you the program is already shaping up to be something really special, and we can't wait to see many of you there in person that time. In the meantime, we will keep using these webinars to come together, exchange knowledge, and build momentum around emerging disinformation threats. Now, let me go through a very quick housekeeping note. The Zoom chat is closed. You have to send your questions through Slido. You can scan the QR code that you see on your screen, or either go to slido.com and enter the password #disinfo. So you don't need to wait until the end of the presentations, because Slido is open throughout all the session. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on EU DisinfoLab YouTube channel and website, maybe tomorrow or next week. And as some of our most loyal attendees already know, we are very happy at EU DisinfoLab to offer live subtitles. They are available in multiple languages. Just click the CC button now from the screen. Yes, that's it. Yes. So you just have to push the CC button, which is on the bottom of your screen, and then you just activate them in your language. Now, before we jump into the HEAT findings, we would love to get a sense of who is joining us today. So please go to Slido and respond to two questions. The first one, we would like to know, where are you joining us from today? Let's see. London with a smile. How not? I love it. Okay, so some EU countries are represented, I'm sure, from many other places, because there are 39 people in the room. Now, since we need to move forward, let me ask you another question. What sector do you represent? Okay, these figures already give us some information. A good amount of people from NGOs, civil societies, corporations, media, a little from academia. Many thanks for this contribution. And now that we are all set, well, it's time to kick off the webinar. Let me introduce today's speakers. Joining us today, we have three members of Logically's global analyst team, Adriana, Lina, and Jake. They bring diverse experience spanning government, media, and the private sector, and have supported a wide range of organizations throughout open source intelligence, narrative monitoring, and threat detection. While Adriana, Jake, and Lina will be speaking today, they represent a much larger team of dedicated analysts, data scientists, and product experts at Logically who made this work, the hit investigation, possible. For anyone new to Logically, this is a technology company that combines advanced AI with expert analysis to help organizations understand, respond to risk in the information environment. To this webinar, we are also joined by my dear colleague, Joe McNamee, Senior Policy Expert at EU DisinfoLab. We are a Brussels-based NGO investigating disinformation campaigns, supporting evidence-based policy, and strengthening democratic resilience across Europe. So with all introductions made, with 44 people in the room waiting to learn more, it's my pleasure to hand over the floor to our first speaker, Adriana. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Anna. I appreciate that. Let's pull up our slide deck real quick. Fantastic. I definitely want to take a few minutes to walk us through the scope and approach behind the HEAT project, just to kind of set the scene before the team really dives into the findings. So let's move on to the first slide. This research was made possible through a grant from the European Media and Information Fund, which supported our effort to better understand how climate disinfo spreads online, and really how it may be undermining public trust, democratic resilience, and climate action across the EU. The grant enabled us to design an independent multi-country research effort focused on identifying patterns of the MDM. So in this case, misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation, with the goal of supporting evidence-based policymaking, platform accountability, and more resilient public discourse. We did focus on three countries, as Anna mentioned, Germany, France, and Netherlands, not because they represent the entire EU, but because they offer a diverse lens into the Europe's information space. These countries vary in media ecosystems, political dynamics, and climate discourse, which really allowed us to explore different national contexts while identifying patterns that cross borders. The work was conducted between last October through the end of April of this year, which really guided a mixed methods OSINT-based approach, combining quantitative analysis with qualitative review. Quantitatively, we looked at post volumes, engagement rates, and platform diffusion across the social media information space. Qualitatively, we also analyzed tone, narrative framing, and how content evolved over time within those national contexts. We also used a combination of Boolean-based keyword queries and actor-seeded searches, starting with things like known accounts that regularly push climate-related disinfo, and then tracing outward to identify the narratives they amplified, the networks they connected with, and then the techniques they used to drive engagement. I really want to reassure everybody that all of our data came from publicly accessible sources, and their research was conducted in full compliance with GDPR and our internal OSINT ethics protocols. We did not include private messaging apps or encrypted platforms in our workflows. We then applied narrative clustering models to group related content into what we call narrative families. And then we use resonance scoring to understand which narratives gain traction and why, whether that was through emotional appeal, influence, engagement, or network effects. To guide our analysis, we built for a four pillars framework that really emerged through early data review and expert consultation. This included four pillars that we really looked at: conspiracy milieu, culture war and partisan discourse, hostile state actor messaging, meaning linked to foreign governments or their proxies. And then we also included big oil aligned messaging, which often seeks to downplay climate action or discredit policy, as most of you are tracking. And then one last note, while this project didn't formally investigate coordinated and authentic behavior, or what we call CIB, meaning fake or misleading accounts working together to manipulate online discourse, we did observe moments of strategic alignment and coordinated amplification through content mimicry and fringe mainstream blending, which my team's going to talk about. Those patterns suggest the tactics are evolving, even if not always centrally orchestrated. So overall, this wasn't just about tracking climate narratives. It was really about understanding the system structures and actors that shaped them. So I'm really excited to kind of hand this over to the team so they can start walking you through that. So Jake, over to you to walk us through our key findings.
Great, thank you, Adriana, and good afternoon, everyone. So hopefully you can now see the new slide, and I'll talk you through some of our key findings. So the project uncovered a lot of valuable insights into how climate-related MDM is created and evolves across Europe. One of the project's key findings was that climate disinformation is becoming increasingly sophisticated and also more strategic in its application. Climate MDM narratives are increasingly politicized and adapted to specific national contexts. For example, in France, narratives frequently focused on the impact to the agricultural sector, with climate policy characterized as European elite overreach, which weakens an economic sovereignty and national identity. And these narratives often integrate anti-globalist conspiracy theories, alleging that the weakening of sovereignty and national identity is an intentional objective of EU climate policy. So in doing so, these narratives dismiss scientific consensus and reframe climate policy as a political mechanism rather than a legitimate response to an ecological crisis. And this ultimately erodes public trust, undermines democratic resilience, and hinders the effective implementation of climate policy. And this politicization also defines climate policy as a source of societal division, with environmentalism being framed as ideologically motivated and ignorant to economic realities. And climate MDM, therefore, not only erodes trust in science, but it fuels this broader societal polarization. Now, as I mentioned, climate MDM actors modify narratives to specific national or cultural contexts to increase resonance. Hello, sorry, I think I might have dropped off there.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think that was my VPN crashing, but I'm back now, so I'll,
Are you ready to continue?
yeah, I can pick up. Apologies about that.
Okay, no problem.
So hopefully you can now see.
Yeah, perfectly. Go on. Thank you, Jake.
Great. So apologies about that. I'm not sure what happened there. But yes, so as I mentioned, climate MDM actors modify their narratives to specific national or cultural contexts to increase the resonance. But despite these nuances, we noted that the core narrative structure remained largely consistent across the three countries we observed, which these narratives targeted climate science, targeted EU institutions, and also key policymakers. And this ultimately functions to encourage distrust rather, and skepticism of policy and governance more broadly. Now, the research also highlighted that the boundaries between mainstream and fringe actors were significantly blurred, So climate MDM narratives were primarily driven by influencers, alternative media, politicians, and political parties. And these actors reinforce one another, with fringe actors deriving legitimacy through political alignment and mainstream discourse incorporating fringe claims and narratives. So a key consequence of this relationship is that the media ecosystem facilitates disinformation to circulate more freely, with false climate MDM narratives often being presented as legitimate discourse. Now, the role of each social media platform in disseminating climate MDM was another key finding. Telegram, in particular, serves as a narrative incubator where content is developed and refined. Specifically, the platform's format of channels and closed groups allows ideologically aligned communities to engage in relative isolation and relatively free from moderation. Once these narratives form and develop in these spaces, their reach is then accelerated through other social media platforms, most prominently X. These Telegram narratives that we observed were then often distilled into more succinct and shareable formats as they were shared to other platforms, which then encourages virality of these narratives. The meme culture of X as well plays a role in normalizing disinformation by masking it in humor, which also makes it more digestible and also more likely to be spread by algorithmic amplification. And this cross-platform disinformation pipeline serves to adapt these fringe discussions into mainstream discourse. Now, a final key finding I'd like to highlight is the fluidity and internationalization of the climate disinformation landscape. So disinformation actors rarely limited themselves by thematic boundaries. Thus, accounts spreading climate MDM also shared anti-globalist content or anti-West narratives in the context of geopolitical events, such as the war in Ukraine or related to Israel and Gaza. Geographic boundaries were similarly ignored by these actors. For instance, actors spreading climate MDM in the French information space in French language often critiqued German climate policy and shared narratives originating in European contexts. A significant volume of climate MDM we observed also originated from the US, particularly alt-right influencers who have become increasingly prominent within the information space, delivering fringe narratives to mainstream audiences. Now, European MDM actors engaged with this content, they shared it to their followers, and they often translated it, increasing its reach. But they also added country-specific claims and localized the narratives in order to increase resonance. And so we note a significant transatlantic flow of disinformation, which is important to acknowledge. But this is not just a passive process. European actors actively engage and shape the narratives to their local context. Now, each of these findings manifested differently across our three information spaces. And so I'd now like to discuss a few snapshots from the three different countries. So firstly, in Germany, climate-related disinformation was deeply embedded within a broader conspiracist and anti-elite discourse. Climate change was frequently portrayed as a manufactured crisis, which was engineered by global elites. Climate MDM builds on distrust of institutions and framed climate policy as a mechanism for population control and surveillance. These narratives also often recycled claims regarding COVID-19, linking climate and pandemic policies to a broader elite agenda to erode civil liberties in Germany. Now, the key amplifiers included alternative news sites and partisan influencers who were active across X and Telegram most prominently. There was also a significant role played by pseudo-academic institutions, such as the European Institute for Climate and Energy, which was a key driver of climate denialist content. Now, these entities present denial as a legitimate scientific discourse, which undermines scientific consensus and increases the resonance of climate MDM narratives, which then ultimately causes them to persist in the information space. In Germany, narratives also linked climate action to the loss of personal freedoms, economic harm, and government overreach. And the role of economic impacts was particularly pronounced in Germany. For example, MDM narratives attributed the closure of Volkswagen factories solely to the Green Deal and the energy transition. And this functions to oversimplify and misrepresent the issue, ignoring other key determining factors like changes in supply chains, global demand, and also competition from overseas manufacturers. So this messaging builds on public anxiety and exploits public anxieties, distorting the relationship between policy and industrial trends, and ultimately undermines trust in climate action and policy making. Now, in France, the role of Telegram channels in incubating climate-related disinformation was particularly pronounced. So these actors were often active on several platforms, with narratives seeded first on Telegram among comparatively small followings. This content was then cross-posted and repackaged or partially disseminated across different social media platforms by these actors after initially amplifying it on Telegram. Now, French Telegram channels also often had specific focuses. So, for example, we observed a lot of channels specifically dedicated to chemtrails and allegations of geoengineering. And we observed this content being formulated initially on Telegram and then disseminated more broadly across the information space. In many cases, these channels were initially established organically as grassroots opposition in response to government policy regarding the COVID-19 pandemic. And these channels over time evolved to engage with a more international, transnational conspiracy milieu, who now amplify climate MDM narratives alongside various interlinked conspiracy claims. And this generalization and universalization of the conspiracy ecosystem is a trend that can be observed much more broadly and internationally. As I mentioned, X is the primary platform for narrative amplification, especially through viral posts and fringe influencers. And in France, these influencers exploited emotional and politically polarizing language to maximize their engagement. They leverage memes, sarcasm, and also outrage to link climate policy to specific national grievances, such as the rising cost of living. And this framing of climate policy often discussed policy as a threat to individual liberties, identity, and national sovereignty. And this was most prominent within the French information space. For example, low emission zones, or ZFEs, were portrayed as a mechanism which was designed to limit societal mobility. And these claims often built on economic grievances, claiming that it was working class citizens which were the primary target of these ZFEs. These narratives also often relied upon populist rhetoric, and so they linked climate policy to transnational governance structures such as the European Union, but also the World Economic Forum, which were characterized as seeking to erode French sovereignty and enact a globalist world order. Finally, in the Netherlands, climate disinformation notably circulated via alternative media and politically aligned pages, particularly on Facebook and X. The Facebook accounts of far-right politicians and also official accounts of far-right political parties were key drivers of claims that environmental policies were designed intentionally to undermine Dutch sovereignty and to benefit EU elites. Dutch climate MDM was amplified by networks which connected far-right individuals, conspiracists, and also climate skeptic actors. These actors blended climate denial with anti-globalist and anti-EU sentiment. And as in Germany, we also saw the prominence of pseudoscientific climate denialist organizations, which amplified content that rejected scientific consensus, as well as integrating claims that it was an elite agenda to mislead the public. Now, a significant proportion of narratives found within the Dutch information space were directly taken from the English language information space and English language conspiracy networks. And in the Netherlands, more so than in France and Germany, the porous nature of the linguistic and national boundaries within the conspiracy ecosystem was particularly prominent. Now, finally, as in the German and French information space, Dutch climate policy was linked to a broader conflict between elites and public interests. For example, the Dutch nitrogen crisis was reframed as an ideologically motivated attack on rural culture and Dutch livelihoods, while the National Citizens Council on Climate was similarly claimed to be an elite-controlled organization which was going to be used to manipulate public opinion and prevent alternative viewpoints from developing. So while climate MDM narratives manifested differently across 3 countries, they are interconnected and shaped by common trends. And so I'll now pass you over to Lina, who's going to discuss some of these cross-country trends.
Great, thank you so much, Jake. Yeah, our research has certainly corroborated what many scholars have observed, that climate denialism has really evolved beyond simple scientific skepticism to become more closely tied with cultural grievances, also Euroscepticism and institutional distrust, underscoring how climate attitudes are increasingly shaped by social and political identities. But what I would really like to anchor on this slide is some of the tactics and techniques used to disseminate climate disinformation that are being employed by hostile state actors, as well as partisan users and conspiratorial figures. Those tactics and techniques are by no means unique to the spread of climate disinformation, but they do vary somewhat based on actor type, reflecting their distinct objectives. So that is, state-linked propaganda networks found to favor scalable amplification methods, such as dissemination through propaganda sites and cross-platform content laundering, while partisan users tend to rely more on emotive framing, meme culture, as well as hashtag seeding, as we observed in the case of Germany. But honing in on the hostile state activities, as part of the project, we examined Russia's climate-related messaging, focusing on the role of state-affiliated propaganda networks and news outlets such as RT. So firstly, despite the formal restrictions, Russia's climate narratives continue to be disseminated by RT and reach audiences via mirror domains, which replicate the content on their alternative URLs. Secondly, we identified climate disinformation within the Copycop campaign, specifically the news sites that were set up ahead of the federal election in Germany. Though I would argue that the climate and environment issues took a backseat during this election period. Our research also found that some earlier efforts where Russia has deployed specialized outlets that were specifically focused on climate and energy policy. Such as the fabricated local news site Grüne Hummel in Germany, which was taken down in late 2024. Additionally, across all the 3 monitored countries, Russia was also found to be disseminating climate MDM through the Portal Combat campaign, also known as the Pravda Disinformation Network. While each of the domains there selectively amplified content specific to the national context, all the sites also reposted content from Russian media outlets, for example, TASS, RIA Novosti, or Lenta. Additionally, all 3 monitored Pravda sites also widely shared climate MDM content from pro-Russia and Russia-language Telegram channels as well. So I would say this network is particularly significant, especially in the light of the recent findings that Pravda content has infiltrated Wikipedia articles and may now be surfacing in the outputs of large language models, which I believe really highlights the substantial risks of Pravda content and their potential to further entrench climate denial and distort public information flows. Next, I'd like to zoom in on one of the specific tactics used to spread climate disinformation, and that is coordinated inauthentic behavior. So as part of the project, we employed Logically's proprietary software, which analyzes anomalous posting patterns, content similarities, as well as repetition to identify CAB. We paired this automated detection with human-in-the-loop analysis, ensuring that each detected cluster was examined for their relevance, their authenticity, and also potential malign intent. Our analysis uncovered one conclusive instance of CIB, and that was within the German language dataset, with no CIB detected within the French and Dutch language datasets. As for the CIB, the cluster consisted of 10 Facebook profiles established between February and July 2024, with 3 of the identified accounts using AI-generated images of young women. All the identified profiles included links to climate MDM sites in their intros and as well as in the bio sections, and they posted content such as climate denialism and geoengineering narratives, while also promoting this broader far-right talking points as well. What I would say is that perhaps the most notable thing about this network is the range of tactics they have employed to evade detection. So starting from the fact that they staggered their profile setup. Additionally, they also use personal profiles rather than pages, which is a tactic that further allows them to really fly under the radar, as there are restrictions on data access for third-party monitoring tools. Additionally, while the content was often the same or near identical that the accounts shared, they varied how it was presented. So, for example, the links in their bios appeared in different order. The same posts would go out days or even weeks apart, and sometimes with different accompanying images. And I believe this really underscores the growing sophistication of CIB. So not really relying on high volume, easily identifiable spam, but instead mimicking some organic behavior. Also with the level of nuance that really challenges both the automated detection as well as us as manual investigators. Beyond the CIB system, our system also flagged other noteworthy strategies used to spread climate mis and disinformation. So, for instance, we observed copypasta style commenting activity where users post identical or near identical messages as comments on their post. While we found that the overall prevalence of this remains limited, there was one very notable case on X, which involved a user posting over 1,800 comments under the post of German news outlets, accusing them of spreading falsehoods about climate change, global conflicts, as well as COVID-19. Additionally, we identified several clusters of identical or near identical posts, and they were detected in all 3 monitored language environments. So these posts rarely cited the original source, which is a common tactic of copypasta style dissemination, as it essentially allows you to obscure the origin of the claims. So this tactic was especially noticeable in the French language environment, where climate disinformation, including the content from actors frequently promoted by Pravda, was then often amplified by low follower accounts on X. And in that instance, we couldn't definitively prove coordination. However, I'd say it's very important to still consider and remain attentive to copypasta activity as this potential vehicle used by hostile state actors to disseminate climate disinformation. Overall, the presence of climate-related coordinated inauthentic behavior across the 3 monitored information environments remains limited. And while the ongoing vigilance is warranted, particularly given the precedent cases where petrostates have leveraged CIB to manipulate public discourse in the past, our research found that CIB is currently not the primary vector for the dissemination of climate mis and disinformation. Instead, I would argue that the more pressing concern lies in the growing normalization of climate mis disinformation within the mainstream political discourse. So it's when the elected officials, the political influencer, and the parties and media figures engage in the spread of misleading climate narratives, they confer a level of legitimacy and reach that far, far exceeds that of CIB dissemination. And on that note, I'd like to end and hand it over to you, DisinfoLab.
Thank you very much, Lina. I guess that's me, unless Anna wanted to jump in. We find that in the analysis that the European framework, legal framework, is failing, but that's a snapshot today. If we look at the situation 3 years ago, we didn't have the Digital Services Act. We only had the e-commerce directive from the year 2000, and that only covered 3 types of internet company, and only dealt with liability protections for internet companies. So situations in which an internet company could not be held liable for providing access to illegal content, for hosting illegal content, or providing network enhancement technologies for illegal content. So since 2022, we have the Digital Services Act, which gives a lot more possibilities to act against content that is, as extensively described in the HEAT project, harmful but not necessarily illegal. The Digital Services Act builds on the e-commerce directive, so it establishes basic principles that internet companies can't be held liable in certain circumstances for illegal content, particularly if they don't know about it. But it builds on this to create an environment for very large online platforms such as X and Facebook, but interestingly not yet Telegram, where they have to mitigate risks of particular types of harmful content that may or may not be illegal. And that is a regime which is described as controlling systemic risks. And systemic risks in the DSA are really what would govern what action can be taken on an EU level and on a national level against the types of coordination that is described in this project. And it's important to note that the Digital Services Act is what's known as a horizontal instrument. That means it deals with all types of content simultaneously. So just because something isn't explicitly mentioned in the DSA as being something that's regulated, it can still be regulated if it fulfills the criteria. And systemic risks in the DSA are defined in a way that reminds me of the former US Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, who said that there are 3 types of knowledge: known knowns, known unknowns, and unknown unknowns. So the known knowns in the Digital Services Act that define systemic risks are the dissemination of illegal content, the dissemination of content that has foreseeable negative effects on the exercise of fundamental rights, any actual or foreseeable negative effects on civic discourse and electoral processes and public security, and negative effects in relation to gender-based violence, public health, and a person's physical and mental well-being. There are also the known unknowns, which are systemic risks of any kind that stem from the design, functioning, and use of services, as well as the potential uses by users, and places obligations on the platforms to take mitigating measures to protect users from these. So if we look at the known knowns, clearly there is a restriction on fundamental rights to coordinated disinformation of the kind over uncovered by this project. Serious climate change can affect the right to life, the right to property, the right to freedom of expression, and more directly, Article 37 of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is the right to environmental protection. Coordinated manipulation is also clearly having an effect on civic discourse, because civic discourse, the whole point of this coordinated manipulation of the online public space is to undermine and manipulate civic discourse and to impact on electoral processes and public security. And the HEAT report shows that there is significant coordinated activity, and that adequate mitigation measures are not being taken, because if the mitigation measures were being taken, then these activities wouldn't be continuing. So the question then becomes how to move things forward. We can deliver these findings to the national authorities responsible for implementation of the Digital Services Act in the EU member states, and also to the European Commission. But most directly, the board, which is a body incorporating the Commission and individual member states, is obliged under the DSA to publish comprehensive reports every year. And these reports are supposed to include identification and assessment of the most prominent and recurring systemic risks reported by the platforms themselves, or through other sources, such as through independent research, like the HEAT project. This report, the first one of which is still due, can outline best practices for providers of the very large online platforms and search engines to mitigate the systemic risks that are identified. So, as a matter of most urgency, we should be in a position to communicate the findings to the 3 member states, and indeed to other member states, to indicate, to highlight what we found, why it is a systemic risk, why it's a breach of the explicit systemic risk list in Article 34 of the DSA, and to ensure that moving forward, when the platforms have to next produce their risk assessments and risk mitigation strategies, that climate disinformation and climate misinformation can be more explicitly dealt with than has been the case up to now. I see that there are a lot of questions building up in the in Slido, so I'll bring this short presentation to a close and hand it over to Anna to moderate the question and answer session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you to all of you for your excellent presentations, and more importantly, for the hard work behind. I'm not sure if you can hear me. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. We're having some technical issues today. So we are 40 people in the room. We have more than 10 minutes for the Q&A. I'm happy to officially open this session. And let's begin. We have a good amount of questions, several related to the methodology and scope. So let's start from there. First one, can you clarify how content was selected for analysis across the 3 platforms?
Sure, I can jump in.
Thank you,
Hi, everybody. I talked a little bit about this in my opening on how content was selected, and I really kind of anchored a little bit on our content was selected using kind of a very tailored Boolean and keyword searches, that actor-seeded discovery, starting with like known disinfo actors and tracing their networks. And once again, when we did kind of that tracing and known disinfo actor networks, it was all public content. So I just kind of want to put that out there. You can also see that in our citations in the report. So if you go back and kind of look at that and then look at truly the combination of the Boolean keyword search, known actor seeded lists, I mean, that really, we started that kind of network there. And then you kind of pile on top of that our framework of those 4 pillars to kind of start peeling away and doing that network. I hope that answers the question. I know it's a very broad question.
Thank you, Juliana. There is another question that says, a lot of emphasis has been put on Telegram and X. Is this a result of research limitations on other platforms like Instagram or TikTok, or it is simply the case that climate misinformation is more prevalent on X and Telegram? Who wants to reply this?
Well, I can say a little bit on this one. I think firstly, I would say that the research reflects what realities of the information space. And so I think the prominence of X and Telegram in spreading in climate MDM, we see this more broadly across sort of different topics as well. These are the main platforms, and that's primarily due to limited moderation and changes in those platforms more recently. But I would mention as well that there are some slight limitations just in terms of the data we're able to collect through GDPR, for example. So as Lena mentioned, when we see Facebook public accounts or private groups, those aren't areas that we look into. And so they're effectively a blind spot. And so it is I think a balance between that. It is very difficult as well to especially because we're looking at open Telegram channels. There are closed Telegram channels. There are closed WhatsApp channels. And disinformation spreads in ways that just by design we're unable to observe. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Jake. Although it is everything in detail in the report, maybe you would like to repeat again which technology was used to arrive to this finding. And also let me merge it with another question. How replicable is this methodology across other policy domains, migration, public health, etc.?
Yeah, sure. So there is more detailed explanations in the report, but we use among other things, our in-house Logically AI proprietary tools to analyze the information environment, to detect these narratives, to also cluster this inauthentic behavior, which we identified, which is very useful particularly when we're tasked with navigating these sort of GDPR boundaries, and to respond to how replicable it is. I believe very replicable. I think, we have a sort of broad experience doing sort of all different sorts of investigations. So I suppose it's difficult to say what, just sort of universalizing it, but yeah, I think generally quite replicable, if that answers your question.
Thank you. Yeah. Now let's change to actors and attribution. Please explain how you distinguish between foreign aligned actors and domestic ideological influencers when narratives overlap. I guess this because sometimes the lines between these actors are blurred. Maybe Lena, you can answer this one.
Thank you. So something to notice, there are 2 things here. One is actor type and the other is the type of narratives. When it comes to foreign actors, this is a known TTP. The narratives they spread are most effective when they're speaking to the concept that the local audiences already know, when they're really focusing on their grievances, issues, or content that is already circulating. So in that case, yes, it is the foreign actors or the hostile state actors that are often amplifying what is already out there, as it is one of the most efficient ways to really drive the misinformation and within the information environment. In terms of specifically identifying who the foreign aligned actors are, we employ a number of different approaches. This includes attribution, for example, when we speak about the Russian networks, especially the news sites, looking at IP addresses, anomalous behavior. So this all factors into our research, in addition to the already public reporting of known actors out there. In our report, we've been very cautious on specifically distinguishing between foreign actors, aligned actors, for example, individuals who might often comment or whose statements might be promoted by, let's say, RT, and then local influencers with no identified or known connections to hostile state actors or hostile state links. I hope that answers the question broadly.
I think it does. And Lina, have you identified any foreign actors beyond Russia playing a role in the EU climate disinformation ecosystem, either directly or indirectly?
Thanks. Yes. So our research focused mostly on Russia. We did have a brief look at the Chinese information environment, China's information environment as part of the scoping exercise, when we were still determining the breadth of the project. However, no significant China-seeded narratives were identified at the time.
Thank you. Now, more content focus. I'm trying to organize the questions now. Yeah. So how do you distinguish between legitimate policy criticism and disinformation? Who would like to answer this question? Maybe you, Joe? Would you like to say something?
I think that the big difference that most the big difference between the two is coordination. I think I think that coordinated disinformation is different from uncoordinated misunderstandings and expressions of personal worries and personal criticisms of individual policies. I've seen that in among policymakers, particularly in discussions in the European Parliament, that there's a big divide between politicians who express concern about thought police and being penalized for saying something that's not correct, and those who understand that we're not dealing with people not understanding. We're dealing with coordinated, structured, financed campaigns to mislead and to pollute the information ecosystem in our democratic societies.
I can jump in here for that too, Anna, just to kind of jump on and add to what Joe was saying here. When we look at this too, we look at that legitimate criticism, right, which typically engages with facts, all the policy outcomes. But in contrast, when we're talking disinfo, that really, really tends to lie on falsehoods, manipulation, that strategic distortion of the information, right, often aimed at undermining, once again, undermining trust, inciting division. That's really kind of that key that's going to drive whether or not, is it disinfo or not. So we assess that against all of those disinfo indicators, right? Going back to what Joe was saying about coordination, right? We see that coordinated spread, recurring false claims, decontextualization. So those are clear. right? So rather than that, then simply express dissent, we have to kind of look at what are all of the indicators before we can determine, is it legitimate policy or is it really disinfo?
Yeah. Thank you, Adriana. I think we have time for 2 more questions. So I'm going to select the ones that I think are pretty relevant. So the first one would be if there are specific audience segments or communities that are most vulnerable to this narrative. Either you, Jack, or Lina may be able to respond to this question because you've been focused on your country.
Yeah, I could say a little bit. I think so naturally it is these sort of fringe communities are more susceptible, and that's when we talk about this sort of this increasingly transnational conspiracy space. So I think particularly after COVID, we see the boundaries between various sort of climate MDM or anti-globalist MDM or whatever conspiracy, these boundaries are really eroded, and we see these overlaps. So what we're seeing is a sort of mainstreaming of conspiracy MDM claims. But I think the key is that even though there may be demographics which are more susceptible, which have less media literacy, for example, I think the key issue is that we're seeing, particularly on platforms like X, with the reduction in moderation and also due to the various political shifts more globally, we're seeing less of we're seeing a rolling back of fact checking. We're seeing less emphasis on sort of objective truth, and the end result of this is that more people, more mainstream audiences become exposed to this content through algorithmic amplification and essentially not having these falsehoods fact checked. And so I think this is an increasingly severe issue that with audiences becoming more vulnerable and essentially less guardrails being put on the spread of MDM.
Thank you, Jake. So I said one more question, but there are going to be 2. So I ask you to just answer me in 30 seconds. One is related to media literacy. Do you think there are enough efforts to counteract the coordinated environmental misinformation campaigns that you have seen? Are we doing enough when it comes to media literacy efforts?
Can I take that on a European level? The incoming presidency of the Council of the EU puts a lot of emphasis on media literacy as a way of dealing with this issue, and the commissioner responsible for such matters is holding a roundtable on Tuesday, where one of the key discussion points is media literacy. So it's recognized on a European level that efforts need to be redoubled. It's not going to be an answer in itself, as Jake pointed out. People are getting fed content through very opaque recommender systems that even experts sometimes don't understand. So the policy is being taken seriously, it seems, by the EU institutions, but we need to have more pragmatic approaches and not rely on media literacy as the solution.
Joe, this question is for you. Please just give me a yes or no, or let's discuss it later. Is it even necessary to have climate disinformation recognized as a specific systemic risk under the DSA? Climate disinformation is so clearly related to Article 34, 1A/D. Sorry for that.
Yes, and in 2 seconds, I think the board's report on experienced systemic risks in individual member states and across the EU, recognizing climate disinformation would be very helpful to provide direction for policy enforcement.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you also for the engagement of the speakers. Thanks, Emmy, for the support. with this project. And thank you, Adriana, Jake, Lina, all the rest of the members of Logically that have been working very hard, and Joe for this outstanding presentation. What you just heard is just the result of ongoing collaborative work over the past 9 months, bringing together investigative and policy expertise to unpack the disinformation dynamics surrounding climate action in Europe. And this is just the beginning. We will continue to promote these findings and the broader HEAT project in the months ahead, because this conversation needs to stay in the spotlight, especially now that we witnessed firsthand that climate disinformation thrives in the information void, the gap between scientific consensus and public understanding. That's exactly why the work of the climate counter disinformation community is more vital than ever. Before we close, I'd like to share 2 important announcements. 3. So remember, I said at the beginning to register at the EU DisinfoLab annual conference happening next October in Ljubljana. There will be over 600 people, so we will have fun. Also, next week on the 3rd of July, we will run at EU DisinfoLab another webinar about how Meta may have channeled money to EU-sanctioned Russia propaganda outlets, with Victoire Rio from What to Fix. And the following week, on the 17th of July, it will be John Rotzenbeck from the King's College London, who will walk us through influence for sale, mapping the online manipulation market. At the end of this webinar, when you close it, you will be prompted to complete a brief survey where you can provide feedback about this webinar. Thank you again to our speakers, our partners from Logically, and these incredible insights, to everyone who joined, again to Emit for their support in making this project possible. I wish you a wonderful rest of the day, and I look forward to see you again soon. Bye.